everybody. Welcome to tonight's episode of Talking Elite. We are on episode 57, and we are continuing our in-depth conversation and look back on the history of WrestleMania. It's WrestleMania season here in the professional wrestling world, obviously coming in April. It has grown so much. It is now 2 nights instead of just one magnificent night that we all remember growing up as kids. This week, we are looking at WrestleMania's 6 through 10. So we're going to be talking about all the matches there, what we liked, what we didn't like, some good moments, some bad moments, some controversies. And just in-depth talk of it. And then towards the end of the show, when we got time, we've also got our pay-per-view coming up for AEW Revolution. We might get into that. Might even get into some TNA talk, depending on how much time we have. But joining me tonight, let me introduce you guys to my panel. First and foremost, one of our favorite people joining our crew. He's a man who knows almost everything about classic pro wrestling. Love to hear his stories. Love talking to him about it, especially his love for Tully Blanchard. But please welcome Mr. Brandon. Brandon, welcome back, bud.
Thank you, sir. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, man. I'm very excited. Before WrestleMania's 11 through 15, which were my favorite, I actually did enjoy some of the WrestleManias between 6 and 10. There was one out there, I think we'll talk about it, which I did not like. But I'm glad you can join us tonight.
Absolutely. Had a good time last week, so here we are.
Perfect. And also joining us back and after a week out or a couple of weeks out from both surgery and just mayhem in her personal life, but we're happy to have her back. She doesn't have cue cards tonight, but she's our cue card girl. Oh, she does. I
do have cue cards. So
okay.
That was a shock yesterday, just getting home, seeing it, because I worked a full day yesterday. I was like, wait, what's going on? So then, and it's just odd to watch old episodes of Nitro and see him as a horse, to see him. So Steve, we love you. Okay. Connor, we love you. We miss you. We hope you're feeling better. And drink brandy because that does help. And our fans, happy belated love to. Oh, God, I got to really get better at this. Hold on.
Not quite Sammy Guevara, but we're almost there.
I had an 11-month-old today, one of my new families, and she slept for like an hour, so it's good. Okay. I had some guy tell me years ago that women who watch pro wrestling was weird and strange. So, guys, let me tell you, in honor of Valentine's Day, if you've got a girl that watches wrestling, she's a keeper.
I totally agree. And so we should have Amer joining us here in a little bit as well. Connor might jump in, although we don't know. He hasn't been feeling well. We wish him well. We also thank all you guys for joining us tonight for our Talking Elite episode. We did cover 1 through 5 last week, and so if you missed it, it is up on our YouTube page. I hope Connor's keeping up with the Spotify. If not, I can understand. He's been doing a lot of stuff and not been feeling well, so we're not going to hold that against him. We want him to feel healthy before he tries to push more stuff out, so we thank Connor for doing all that, because again, without him, our show wouldn't be what it is. So we do thank you, Connor. But tonight we are going to be talking about WrestleMania's 6 through 10, and it is crazy because it kind of stayed almost the same from 1 through 7, but then there were some changes going on after 8 and 9, especially 10. 10 is where you kind of saw a big change in personnel and pro wrestlers on the card, but there really wasn't much of a difference. But we start out right now with WrestleMania 6. And before I get into it, I know, Danny, you weren't here last week, but we talked about moments and the first WrestleManias we ever saw growing up. So from you, Danny, what's the first WrestleMania memory you have? Which was the first one you ever saw? And, which one stuck with you?
First one I ever saw was 1. I was, of course, a grade schooler back in that day. So the first one that I remember was 1. And what made number 1 so special is it was the WWE version of what I grew up with as Starrcade. So it was kind of like how Starrcade was the big deal. And every time I bring up Starrcade, all I can see, LOD, God bless their souls, Jim Cornette hanging from the scaffold match with ME1. Every time somebody's mentioned Starrcade, that's the only thing I can think about.
Well, see, her and I are new to each other. I was actually at the first Starrcade. That is why I'm going back. That's why I'm going to Revolution. I was born and raised in Martinsville, Virginia, and we used to go to Greensboro for the big shows. And I had nosebleed seats, and I was 10, but I was there. So I'm going back to see Sting's last match. So
God,
Flair versus Race, Youngblood and Steamboat versus the Briscoes. Oh,
yes.
Wow.
Yeah. But again, that's like the first thing that I remember. But then also, and I think what made WrestleMania special, the first one, you had Mr. T, who at that point was coming off of that Rocky III fame, and you had the A-Team as he was like B.A. Baracus or something. Then you also had Hogan, who at that point was out of the NWA, was I think slowly making that return back to WWE. Well, no, he was in WWE, so he was out of AWA. Forgive me, I've been at cold medicine myself for almost 3 days. And then he was also capitalizing off of that Rocky III hype. So we were kind of like transitioning, and he was becoming the name. And I think the other thing that just made it special was that it was something different compared to Starrcade. You had all of these celebrities that were involved in it, and then you slowly got into the rock and wrestling connection. Another one that I vaguely remember was WrestleMania 2, because it was shown in like 3 different arenas. And then obviously WrestleMania 3 because of Hogan Andre. 4 and 5 were held at Trump Towers or Trump Plaza, I think. And if you look closely, you see, sorry, there goes Stella. Hold on. Stella, can you move, please? Thank you. You can also see Donald Trump sitting right there at WrestleMania. And a couple of years ago, during the pandemic, when they did the first night of WrestleMania, a couple of years ago on 2 separate nights, I went back and binge watched all of them. I mean, I had nothing to do during the pandemic. When I look back and forth and I go, oh my God, that's Donald Trump. And he doesn't look like he doesn't look overly tanned. He looked completely different to the point that I didn't recognize him. But yeah, that's basically all I remember, bits and pieces. But if I had to pick one between 1 and I would say 5 that was my favorite, I would go with 4.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be 1 through 5. It could be any of them. I mean, we all have different memories, especially the viewers at home. Some of them probably came in late for some of the later WrestleManias, maybe between 2010, 2020, 2000 to like 2020. So there's viewers that come into the WrestleManias at different times. And before we move on, let me welcome our next person. As I said, they were coming, so now they're here. One of our favorite new people, part of the AE's in Canada crew, but he's always joining us here, and I love the conversations and stories he has. Amer, thank you for joining us tonight, bud.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. I was a little confused. I was expecting it to be at 9 o'clock my time, but Connor started early. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I jumped out of the living room and here I am. So, yeah.
No, and it's okay. But yeah, no. So we're excited. We're going to be doing this every week, every Thursday until we get up to WrestleMania 40, which I can't believe it's already the 40th WrestleMania. Makes me just feel very old. But again, we're covering the retrospect because we do cover a lot of AEW. Hell, we talk about TNA a lot. But, you know, we have to include pro wrestling because before we didn't have AEW in the early days, you know, so we had to watch WCW, WWF, ECW for people that are like me that stay up till 11 o'clock to watch the syndicated ones in Chicago. But, you know, we had those memories growing up, and that's why I figure every WrestleMania season is going to be different and special. And I wanted to do this every week to cover WrestleManias. So again, last week we covered 1 through 5. This week we're doing 6 through 10, and we actually start with 6, which broadcasted from Canada, the first time they had a show outside of the U.S. And I just want to get the thought on this because, again, Amer, being from Canada, I'm sure you remember the WrestleMania 6 in Canada. For you, as a Canadian. How did that feel finally seeing a promotion like that actually coming to your country and actually doing a show like this?
I wasn't as much into wrestling at this point. My fandom had kind of wavered a little bit. And, it wasn't like nowadays where you can follow it on the internet, obviously. But it was a big deal because people were starting to talk about it. My friends at school were starting to talk about it, and there was a lot of excitement about it. I've reconnected with some friends who were there. And, yeah, it was a big deal. Like you could feel it. There was some electricity in the air, as Gorilla Monsoon would say. And this kind of, rekindled my interest a little bit. Like, yeah, oh, wow, we got some good stuff going on here. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and Brandon, going to you, we talk about pro wrestling promotions doing different markets, and this was something just brand new for WWF back in the day, was going over the border and doing a show like that. And now we see how it's progressed today. Do you think we will see more of, I don't want to say more different, pretty much places of pro wrestling companies going anywhere? I mean, WWF's been doing it for a while, but do you see, we just saw with AEW, do you see other promotions, even small promotions like TNA, do you see them doing more international shows?
I do. Well, TNA is going to depend on what Anthem actually wants to do with it. There's been so much speculation of them just, not wanting to do a whole lot with it, and got tired of arguing with Scott D'Amore because he wanted to do more. I mean, but you never know what actually happened. But, they did real well when Jarrett first opened the promotion years ago. They did real well overseas in England and stuff, places like that. They actually drew a big house as well. So when AEW did as well as they did at Wembley, I was not surprised. So we will see with this one right here. If this one had failed, we wouldn't be seeing that. At least we wouldn't have seen it for a long time. If this one had failed outside the U.S., it would have been a long time before the WWF or anybody else tried it again.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. I think kind of like what AEW with going to London for All In did, kind of as a big risk, and it paid off. This WrestleMania 6 in Canada was a big chance, especially at the Sky Dome, one of the more popular arenas in the whole world, so in Toronto. So, but this
card new, actually. It was, Adam, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it was new, right? Skydome actually opened in 1989, right? So it was brand new, state of the art. 1989 was actually the last year that the Toronto Blue Jays played in Exhibition Stadium. And in 1990, they started in Skydome. As a matter of fact, they played their first game a couple of days before or after WrestleMania. So, this was an opportunity for WWE to be there and practically open the place.
Yeah, no, and it was, and like you said, something new like that. So WWF took a chance on it, and I mean, look at it now. Now it's a very popular, in Canada. So, but this card was very interesting. You had some decent matches on it. I'll run down the card for everybody in it. Well, you had a pre-match before the show, obviously. Paul Roma versus the Brooklyn Brawler. Rick Martel versus Coco Beware. You had Demolition against the Colossal Connection, which was Andre the Giant and Haku. Haku obviously being part of that famous Samoan dynasty. Earthquake versus Hercules. Brutus the Beefcake versus Mr. Perfect. Roddy Piper versus Bad News Brown. The Hart Foundation versus the I am always pronouncing it Bolsheviks. That's right. The Barbarian versus Tito Santana. Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire versus Randy Savage and Queen Sherry. Orient Express versus the Rockers. Jim Duggan against Dino Bravo. Ted DiBiase versus Jake Roberts. Big Boss Man versus Hakeem. Let's get into Hakeem. We'll get into that. Rick Rude versus Jimmy Snuka. And obviously the headline match was Ultimate Warrior versus Hulk Hogan. Now, as far as pay-per-views and lineups go, we kind of seen majority of these same people on the card years before. Obviously it has changed, but there's still some names out there that has been on other WrestleMania cards before. Danny, out of all those names that I just listed, which ones do you think really put their name can kind of compete with someone like a Shawn Michaels, who's known as Mr. WrestleMania. Which one of those names do you think could compete with Shawn Michaels as Mr. WrestleMania and having so many matches at a WrestleMania?
Oh, that was a good one. Honestly, I'm gonna say the Hitman, because the Hitman, one, is was born into the business of obviously the Hart Dungeon up in Canada. Two, he had such a technical style that was very close to, and I'm going to say it, Chris Benoit, because Benoit, I also believe, was trained by Stu Hart, if I remember correctly. And I think three, I mean, look at how many WrestleManias the Hitman's been involved in. Mm-hmm. And then you take into account, too, the Hitman's old school style with HBK style. Boom, mega powers colliding. There you go. So I'm going to say the Hitman, largely because of his style and just how many WrestleManias he's been on, which again, don't quote me, but I think he's had quite a few, almost as many as HBK has.
Pretty close.
Right. Yeah. Pretty close. And Brandon, my question to you, there's a match on this card that really was the first ever. And that was the mixed tag match between Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire against Randy Savage, Green Sherry.
That's not quite where I thought you were going with it, but okay.
Right. No, but it was the first. It was the first mixed intergender tag match in WrestleMania history, and now we saw it more and more throughout, the years to come of intergender matches. Do you feel like it has completely gone past the gimmick stage and now it's become like a main attraction for most promotions?
Absolutely, because the women put in the work. They're not just making them out there to be, a mascot per se, like they used to be back in those days. And I mean, really, Sapphire was in her 50s right then. She was not. She was not an athlete the way they are today. So yeah, they're definitely a main attraction today. I mean, look at the match. I mean, it would have been a bigger draw. It had been The Rock and Ronda Rousey versus Triple H and Stephanie, but Kurt Angle in that spot did well, as in my opinion as well. So you can definitely draw money with the right people.
Right. And to say that was the only match on the card that actually had women wrestling in it, because before that, I think we talked about it last week, only WrestleMania, I believe 3 or 4 had a women's match on it, and that was it. You didn't see another women's match in a while. Was it 2, Amer?
One and 2 did, and then 3,
1 and
4,
2,
and
then after that, you didn't have any single women's matches. So it was kind of an interesting thing to say. And sticking with the card, Amer, I'll ask you this. With the card, especially this card, you see a lot of the same names that you saw at the previous WrestleMania, at WrestleMania 5.
Yes, you do.
Out of this card, which matchup, besides the main event, obviously, which matchup definitely drew attention besides the main event, do you think?
Not a lot of them did. I'm looking back at these, and you know what? I mean, I listened again to Bruce Prichard and his memories of WrestleMania 6. And I'm trying to remember, what I got out of it. I think two of them kind of stick out in terms of just, talking points, I guess you could say. The first was Demolition against the Colossal Connection, because that was really Andre's last match, right? And he didn't do anything. He stood on the ring basically the whole time. He really couldn't go. He was in a lot of pain. And so Haku basically had to do all of the work. And then in the end, it was just basically, Bobby Heenan berating Andre for the loss and blaming him. And then, Andre kind of taking it out on Bobby and, not for real, of course, and, turning babyface and then kind of riding off on one of those carts. They had those carts like at WrestleMania 3 that we talked about, because Skydome was just so cavernous and big. And so Andre just rode off into the sunset and, got the face pop. And then the other one was the Roddy Piper against Bad News Brown.
That's the one I thought he was going to ask me about.
Yeah, because that's the one where, of course, Roddy Piper, had half of his body dyed in this black ink, and was just that was something. And actually, Conrad Thompson and Bruce talked about that for quite a bit, talking about, didn't Bad News Brown have a problem with this? And Bruce said, no, not really. It was really just kind of part of the match. And it was, how it came across to me is, I mean, obviously we look back at that and we say, holy crap, how racist was that? But it wasn't even that. I guess really the thought process, as Bruce said, is that, look, it was just, that's just how it was. It was a different time, the racism conversation, perhaps, like we've had it over the last 40 years, didn't even really exist. And Bad News didn't have a problem with it. And Bruce made it very clear that if Bad News had a problem with something, he would have said something. And a lot of people may not know about that, I heard this also from that podcast, is that Andre the Giant basically took the cleaning solution or whatever Roddy had.
Yep, and he had to ride back in the plane on it way back like that.
Yeah, that's right. He basically flushed it down the toilet. And so Roddy had to go back home, on the airplane, half black. So, but what are you going to do? Like, hey, Andre, you're going to get into Andre's face? I don't think so.
Well, and that match is going to wind up at some point costing me $2,500.
Why is that?
Well, I've got just about every Roddy Piper figure that's ever been made.
Oh, I see. Okay.
They made one of those. It was the WWF Classic Superstars. They made one of the Piper half black, half white.
Oh my!
And it was a limited edition, one of 3,000. And the ones that I can find range between $2,500 and $3,000.
Wow. Yeah, I'm telling you, it was a different time. You never see those figures marketed today, right?
No, like I said, so at some point that's going to cost me some money. I'm going to break down and get it one day.
Well, let's talk about that. That wasn't the only thing that was also controversial back then, but also allowed back then because you didn't have too many sensitive people back then. But let's talk about not only Roddy Piper having that half body, but a character like Akeem, a big white dude portraying a big African dude. Like for me, like today that wouldn't fly, but back then, yeah, it could because that was those were characters. It was maybe insensitive to some people, but a lot of people don't see it that way. They just saw this guy as a villain.
Well, a lot of people to this day swear that Akeem and Virgil were both shots at Dusty Rhodes. So.
Really?
Yeah, I've heard denials of it, but I mean, come on.
The only person I've ever heard deny it's Bruce Pritchard. Bruce Pritchard's like they were characters, and you could hear it in his voice. They said it was Vince taking shots at Dusty, being Virgil Runnels being the booker of Crockett, and then of course the American Dream, and Dusty being heavy set. They were both shots on Dusty.
Yeah.
Right. And honestly, like I said, I don't think today you can get away with some of that stuff today with those characters and what Roddy did with the half the body. But, that's hearsay. But the biggest draw on this card was the main event. I mean, we're not going to put it past us. You had two of the biggest baby faces facing each other, current champions. You had the Intercontinental Champion Ultimate Warrior against what I like to call the egomaniac Hulk Hogan. And it was actually a decent match. And
yes, it was a lot better than I expected it to be.
Yes, and the fact that Hogan put Warrior over, and it to many people today of hearing stories about Hogan and his ego and his being in charge of booking, for you guys, was those the early days of where you can remember maybe Hogan could put people over even before what we got at WrestleMania 7?
Well, the one thing I've heard from a lot of people about Hulk Hogan, despite, and I've told you I hated him as a kid. I despised him. But, a lot of people have come out and said that, for as much slack as he gets, that, he didn't mind putting somebody over. If you told him that he was going to lose, he would say, okay. But then his next response would be like, okay, then what? And if you could not answer the then what, that's where he had a problem. Correct. If you didn't have a place to go with it afterwards, that's when he would come back with, well, that doesn't work for me, brother. And he didn't mind laying down, but you had to have a plan in place to move forward afterwards. And a lot of people, just didn't.
Russo had a big problem with him for exactly that, right? Yeah. Russo would book a show, and then Hulk would say, okay, then what? And Russo, of course, wouldn't really have an answer. So that's where a lot of that became a problem.
And Eric Bischoff has said he's been asked about the creative control clause in Hogan's contract, and he said that was the only time he ever exercised it.
Correct.
Was Jeff Jarrett.
Yeah, Danny, I'd love
those years.
I'd love to get your take. I'd love to get your take on that, Danny, about the early days of Hogan before his total ego took over and put Warrior over.
I remember when I was just a kid, again, growing up in Green Bay watching AWA wrestling, and my grandmother didn't like Hogan either. She was, and I've said this before, Adam, for Amer and Brandon don't know this, but my maternal grandmother's what got me into pro wrestling. And I just remember watching it and, him as a heel in the AWA. And that was back in the early 80s before he did Rocky 3. Then he came back and was a face. And I just remember grandma saying she didn't like him, but he was laughing all the way to the bank. And I feel like Hogan, I can definitely see him saying that. And all in my mind, as Amer and Brandon are talking about this, all I'm thinking is Bash at the Beach 2000, when that was the one where Jarrett laid down for him in the middle of the ring. And that was the one where Vince Russo cut that scathing promo on Hogan. And you got to think about, your characters, how pro wrestling is what I like to call an athletic soap opera, because they're athletes with a pinch of a comic book character. So you've got all your emotions that you would in a soap opera, you've got your storyline, but then they're larger than life comic book characters. So then you got to wonder, was this version of Hogan that we saw in the NWO, was that a fictionalized version of who he was backstage coming to life?
Yeah, I mean, Bash at the Beach 2000 is a whole show in and of itself, and we probably we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But there was so much going on there, and I mean, I've listened to a lot of things about it, and everybody had an angle, everybody had an agenda, and it seems to me, based on what I've heard, it's just basically Vince Russo trying to push forward. Okay, this is what I want to do, and not having enough time to explain to everybody what he had in mind, and maybe not having the full picture in his mind.
When he did the New Blood versus the Millionaires Club, that was the closest thing to a shoot you were getting on TV back then, because that's the God's to honest way he felt about it.
Yeah, but the thing is, he was just booking it kind of week to week, and I get it. He was in a chaotic environment. I'm not blaming him or dumping on him, but a guy like Hulk Hogan is going to want to know what's next. And when Vince comes to him and says, "Okay, Hogan, this is what we're going to do," and he can't answer the question, "What's next?" He's like, "I'm sorry, I can't answer that right now. We got a show in 30 minutes." That became a problem.
Getting older.
There were other issues, obviously, but
getting older though, and watch it. Even though it was the heel and he cheated to win, but he laid down for Arn Anderson on Nitro.
He did. Yep.
Then he laid down for Billy Kidman at a pay-per-view.
Yes, he did. Well, didn't make Kidman look too great, but yeah.
I mean, regardless, he took the 1, 2, 3.
He did. He did.
So,
and he took it for Warrior here. Yeah, and he did well. And the other thing is, he was also going off to make Suburban Commando, right? So it's going to be interesting that when we talk about this group of WrestleManias, there will be some there's some interesting discussions to be had, and some parallels to what we're seeing in WWE even today. And I'm just history may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes really well.
Well, absolutely.
And that's kind of interesting.
She talked about Hogan going to the, laughing all the way to the bank. Well, that's what he did after the Russo shoot, because he sued, and
that's right.
And he laughed all the way to the bank again. So
he did,
and he did. And the other thing to think about too is, okay, well, we can say whatever we want about Hogan, but you know what? He and Vince had that kind of relationship, and Vince was always like, you know what? Hogan must pose, right? That's what the people came to see. And, we as wrestling fans, we may not like it, but you know what? That's what made money. And you can't argue with that. That's what it was about.
And again, going back to what we're talking about most of these WrestleManias we're talking about now, especially 1 through 10. Well, yes, 1 through 10 is where you see the early days of Hogan, which is a good segue into our conversation about WrestleMania 7, the return of Hogan being on top of the world again. This card, to me, was a very interesting one, just because you had some very interesting matches. You also had a great moment in blurring the lines of reality and pro wrestling sports entertainment. And that is the story of Miss Elizabeth and Randy Savage reuniting. As many people know, this was during the time Randy Savage was King Randy Savage, and he was with Sherry.
That was 7, correct?
Yeah, 7.
Yeah, that was 7.
Yeah, that was 7. But the story just it really blurred the lines of reality and pro wrestling. I mean, we saw it a lot back in pro wrestling as kids and growing up. Of this is just it's kayfabe. You know, we talk about kayfabe being dead at some point, but during this time, kayfabe was alive. You know, you never saw the faces and the villains together. You know, but this card actually I thoroughly enjoyed. This was actually one of my favorite early WrestleManias, WrestleMania 7. Definitely just also because this is where you had different commentators, you know, switching it up. You know, you had Gorilla and Bobby on there, but then you had some people come on for some of the matches. You know, you had Jim Duggan come on for Barbarian Haku versus Rockers. Then you had Lord Alfred Hayes. We talked about him last week. The Great Britain Lord Alfred Hayes doing the Big Boss Man, Mr. Perfect. And then celebrity guests because this pay-per-view took place in LA. So, of course, you had to have celebrities. And Regis Philbin guest commented on the Hogan versus Slaughter match. But this card was really good. Let me go through some the card.
Real quick before you
go ahead.
Before you dive into 7 real quick, there's a couple of things on 6 I wanted to go back on.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, let's do little tidbits of information. The Hart Foundation against the Bolsheviks, being Nikolai Volkov and Boris Zukov. Does anybody remember who Boris Zukov actually started as?
I do.
Oh my God, it's just
he was in Crockett.
He was
with Sergeant Slaughter.
He was Khrushchev.
No, that was one of Demolition.
That was one of Demolition.
Boris Zukov was actually a private for Sergeant Slaughter with Don Kernodle. He was Private Jim Nelson.
That's right.
Okay.
And then you go a little further down with the Orient Express. Does anybody remember who they were?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was Pat Tanaka.
Yeah, Tanaka. Yeah.
But it was bad company because Paul Diamond was the one under the mask.
That's right.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Okay. And what year was this?
WrestleMania 6. It was the Orient Express, but being Paul Diamond was not Oriental, they put him under a mask.
Yes.
Yeah, it was 6. It was WrestleMania 6. Yep. Yeah.
So just
kind of like how Yokozuna is actually Samoan, but he was portrayed as.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Before we got too far into 7, I wanted to go back into that because like I said, that's the stuff that I go back and look at and like, oh yeah, I remember them.
Oh yeah, and that's great, and that's what's nice about I guess one of the positive things about characters in WWF's early days is they were wrestlers in other promotions given these gimmicks and an opportunity to do something that they didn't like or they did like, but they ran with it. Someone like a Matthew Bourne who ran with the Doink the Clown character all the way up until his passing. So it's so nice fun to hear about these wrestlers who did these characters in WWF when they were somebody else in another promotion. So that's always enjoyable. But moving on to 7, and then we'll do this at the end of 7 too, Brandon, because I love these little tidbits. Yeah. Because also I think last week Amer did some too.
Yeah, I have some as we go.
Okay, great. Yeah. So going over the card, we started out with Coco Beware against the Brooklyn Brawler. That's one of the pre-show matches. Then we had the Rockers against the Barbarian and Haku. And you had Texas Tornado, one of the great Texas Tornadoes in Kerry Von Erich wrestling in WWF against Dino Bravo. Then you had the British Bulldog versus the Wardlow. You had Nasty Boys. One of
the Warlord. I don't think Wardlow was born yet.
Anyway. Warlord. Sorry, I said Warlord. Sorry, I brought up Danny's boyfriend. Then you had the Nasty Boys, which one of my favorite tag teams in the WWF, against the Hart Foundation. Then you had Jake Roberts against Rick Martel, the Undertaker's very first WrestleMania match against Jimmy Snuka. The Ultimate Warrior against Randy Savage, which we'll get into because that was by far the best match on the card. Then you had Tenaru and Kitayo against Demolition. Then you had Big Boss Man versus Mr. Perfect, Earthquake against Greg Valentine, Legion of Doom against Power and Glory, Virgil against Ted DiBiase, the Mountie against Tito Santana, and of course the headline match, Hulk Hogan and Sergeant Slaughter, which we'll also get into. But let's go back to the beginning of what I talked about, people that got opportunities in WWF, and someone like Kerry Von Erich coming along and getting the gimmick of the Texas Tornado and just kind of running with it. What did you guys take watching his early days in WWF? What do you guys remember as his Texas Tornado character?
I was disappointed that you could tell he was not the same guy that I had watched in World Class, that wrestled Ric Flair for the NWA title in Texas Stadium. I didn't know at the time he had lost his foot. I learned
nobody did.
Learned that down the road later in life. So, but between that, and his very well documented drug problem at the time, which is why he wound up getting fired anyway. It was, to get the family on TV like that and get the name out there. That was one of the reasons I've heard. Now, you never know what's true and what's not, but one of the reasons I had heard that they took the Kerry Von Erich name away from him and went with Texas Tornado because he was just not the same guy anymore.
Yeah.
Right. But if you remember when they announced him, when Howard Finkel announced him, he still said the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich. He still announced it.
Yeah.
The announcers, the ring announcers did, but the
commentators
never did. It was always just the Texas Tornado. So you only got the smidget of Kerry Von Erich. You didn't get it was always Texas Tornado, slings him into the ropes, Texas Tornado out of the way, so they did a pretty good job of what they wanted to do of, kind of feeding the people that knew who he was, but backing away from it slowly but surely.
Yeah, and Danny, I want to get your take on that too with Kerry Von Erich coming out as a Texas Tornado, getting a quick win in 3 minutes, 11 seconds, one of the shorter matches on the card. Do you think that also kind of just put it as a down for him? He's like, I didn't get a long match, and you watch the match that he had with Ric Flair go on for a while. They had long matches. The Von Erich had very long matches, and then he gets this 3-minute match at WrestleMania, biggest moment in his life. Do you think that also kind of contributed?
I remember vaguely watching, it was World Class Championship Wrestling. Is that right, Brandon, that I'm thinking of? Is that the...
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that's it. And I remember seeing it. They showed it on ESPN when I was a kid. So I remember seeing them, and I always remembered the barefoot people because I could never remember their name. And I remembered, there's so many of them, and the Von Erichs always wrestled barefoot. And to borrow a story that's kind of non-related but related, there's a supermodel called Gia Karanji. She was one of the first supermodels, and she was photographed by Francesco Scavullo, who did like all of her covers for Cosmo. And shortly before she passed away, if you look from like one of her first covers to her last cover, you could see that the life was draining from her eyes. And I think and that was because of a drug problem. And I think just with Kerry, with everything that he's gone through, just, the loss of 2 brothers and how they're cursed by suicide and his drug problem. I think once he got into, WWE, I didn't even know that he didn't have a foot either, to be honest with you. I learned about that later. And I think that was part of where his light was dimming. I think by that time it was like the light was on. Let's put it here in the curio cabinet. My grandmother had one of those on display. Let's dress it up, make it look all nice because he's a Von Erich. But then when you think about the drug issues that he had, the fact that his self-esteem was probably shot in the process, plus he lost part of himself when he lost his brothers, his light was dimming. And I think we saw it dim at WrestleMania 7.
No doubt. No doubt. The only thing I would kind of add, like where I was kind of thinking about this was, and we'll talk about it much more at WrestleMania 8, I think. But sadly, we're here talking about, we remember him from World Class. The bottom line, unfortunately, was that for a lot of WWE fans, they had no idea who he was.
Nope.
Right? The name Kerry Von Erich meant nothing to most of the WWE audience at the time. So that was kind of my thought, and that was true for, unfortunately, a lot of people who had established themselves elsewhere, but had to be either reinvented or repackaged or represented, for the WWE audience.
Well, you talk about them not knowing the Von Erich name, and we'll get to WrestleMania 8, but just to throw that in there before we get there, the WWE audience not being familiar with people from the South and the NWA, is why that card got changed from what it was originally supposed to be. So
yes,
yeah, and that's it's the unfortunate thing that in those early days, most of the audience don't know. Today's audience, they're a little more smart. We've got the internet. Unfortunately, we got dirt sheets, which half the time you shouldn't believe. But you've got sources today to people research who these wrestlers are that come over to their promotion, which is the nice thing. Back then, though, it was very hard to figure out who didn't know who these people were, only their character. Again, like the Texas Tornado, like Doink the Clown, like all these guys that didn't have their real names. Like even like a Hulk Hogan, everybody knew Hulk Hogan. That was basically Terry. Terry was Hulk Hogan. It's sad to think that, but that's how he was. But someone like a Von Erich, but going through that also brings up the whole character thing. And the one character we got introduced to at WrestleMania 7 was The Undertaker, whose career just expanded decades, starting off, at WrestleMania 7, basically the start of his WrestleMania streak, and really wasn't brought up at that WrestleMania or most WrestleManias, I think, until WrestleMania 17 or 18.
18.
Maybe 18 is when they started really putting the streak in, but we got to see him premiere, and it was an interesting gimmick. Do you guys just remember the faces of the kids they showed at that WrestleMania? They're just like, oh, that's
WrestleMania,
scary.
not so much, but I remember when he came out at the Survivor Series.
5-6
months before that, and
the crowd was just like,
what in
the heck is this guy?
And the thing for me being, being a Crockett fan, I'm sitting there going, oh my God, that's Mean Mark.
Yeah. Mark Calloway.
And I remember watching him too, like as one of the skyscrapers with Dan Spivey on 5:05 East, 6:05 Eastern Saturday night on TBS with Bob Caudle was on there. David Crockett, young Cody Schiavone. Yeah, I remember watching it, and I always remembered him because of the hair and the beard and just his unique features. And then he shows up at Survivor Series, and I was like, oh my God. I was like, who knew? And there's only two people that have ever scared me like that. The Undertaker and the evil priest in the Poltergeist second movie, the second Poltergeist movie. He scared the crap out of me. So did the Undertaker.
Yeah. And it was interesting because, obviously we talk about Survivor Series. He was with Brother Love. And then here he's with Paul Bearer. So, and it was just something different, and it really took off. And for me as an Undertaker fan, just going back to watch his debut and what he eventually kind of evolved into today, basically was just Mark, doing his thing with the character. Would you not agree, Amer?
Yeah.
Yes. 100%. And two things from that I take away. One, regardless of what you're going to do in any form of entertainment, right? We talk about, how things are today and, the differences between WCW, WWE, AEW versus WWE, whatever. But regardless of what you're going to do, you have to make a connection with the audience some way, somehow. There's umpteen number of ways to do it. The WWE way at that time, certainly, maybe not so much today, is to have a character. Right? Have something that the audience can kind of wrap their heads around. And The Undertaker did it so well, obviously, right? Because he became that character. He lived it. You don't see Mark Calloway. You see The Undertaker when you look at this guy, right? And he's made it last 30 years by changing the what and the how, but never the why. I'm going out there to be The Undertaker because I have that connection with the audience. Maybe sometimes I'll go out as the American badass. I'll change my look a little bit this way. I'll change my look a little bit that way. But you know what? The why is always the same. I'm going out there to deliver the Undertaker to these people. And that's why he has stood the test of time. That's what I feel.
Yeah, and I think another character, and actually just story-wise in that whole pay-per-view we'll get to right now, is Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage. These guys have been part of that company for a long time. They're just legends in professional wrestling, these two guys. Both, sadly gone now, and, but left great legacies. And one of that legacy was that retirement match. Yeah. Even though Randy Savage came back the WrestleMania year after, but that match alone had so many great moments. And I just want to get your guys' take on that match, because to me, that might have been the best match on the card, bar none. And I just want to go one by one with you guys, starting with Brandon, then we'll go Danny and Amer. I just want to get your take on that match, because by far that was the best match on that card. Brandon?
Yeah, I was sitting here scrolling through the matches, and I mean, the debut of The Undertaker was definitely a moment. His WrestleMania debut, but no, there's nothing that touches this match. I mean, it had story. It had, its ups, its downs. And, Savage hitting, I think if I remember correctly, he put 4 or 5 elbows in a row on the Warrior.
He did.
And then Warrior still kicked out, and then, winded up just standing up in the middle of the ring and doing the shoulder tackles one after the other, and then getting the pinfall. And then Sherry kind of having that look on her face like her meal ticket was gone, and then the whole transformation into where they kept showing Elizabeth in the crowd, and then her coming down, and she wasn't sitting front row. She was sitting, kind of toward the back.
Yeah.
And then had her come down and get physical for the first time. That's the first time we ever seen her get physical and pull Sherry off. And it's things like that. It's like I do my best on, today's wrestling, whether it be WWE, AEW, whatever I'm watching, to not judge so much, because I know what I like. I know that I like, most people like what they came up on. So I don't fault I'll say a Jim Cornette or some of these older guys that talk, because of course they're going to be more prone to what they did. They're going to like what they did better. It's like my son, he got into TNA with AJ Styles and Samoa Joe, that time with Fortune and stuff like that. So, he prefers the original stuff of TNA a lot better than, he's a big AEW fan, but he prefers that time in wrestling. And I told him, I said, that's what you grew up on. We're all kind of, but nothing in any company right now is gravitating a story being told the way it did with, like this match did, bringing Elizabeth back, having her get physical for the first time after she's been a character on TV for the past 4 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. Her and Savage reuniting after she hadn't been on TV for at least a year, if not more. And, just the whole audience, it's like she said earlier, back in when I remember growing up, people used to say that wrestling was a soap opera for men. Because you had Days of Our Lives, Young and Restless, and all that stuff for the women, yeah. and pro wrestling was a soap opera for men, and that's where I miss a lot of stuff in today's wrestling. Is there's just no story being told. It's just a moment after moment after moment. With when the show goes off, it's just like, oh, okay, it's done. Not the oh man, I got to see what they do next week. What's going to happen next week. There's none of that left. The WWE's trying a little bit with the Roman Rock Cody stuff. With trying this 2-year story and, having to kind of do an about face with the Rock turning heel and everything now. But most of what you're watching, it doesn't matter what promotion you like. It goes off, and there's nothing to drag you in or pull you in to, I'll just use SmackDown, for example, because, it comes on tomorrow. SmackDown goes off. There's nothing to go, I got to see Raw Monday night. I got to see where they keep up with this. AEW goes off on a Wednesday night. Like last night with Taven and Orange Cassidy, it goes off. There's nothing to, I know Collision's preempted this week because of the NBA, but in most weeks it's there, but there's nothing there on a Dynamite. He goes, oh my God, I can't wait till Saturday night. Yeah. There's nothing in today's wrestling like the story that match told.
Yeah. And Danny, following to you, I mean, that match alone, I mean, how did that affect you while watching it and then after?
I want to definitely speak on something that Brandon just said. Again, you don't have what's known as the cliffhanger in wrestling. And so, fun thing, Amazon Prime has all 14 seasons of Dallas, the original.
I watched it. Don't worry. I watched it.
Yeah, and
I ran a website. Everything about Dallas. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. And I watched it during, and I'm sitting here, watching it when, at work when my little one's asleep, and I'm sitting here like, oh my gosh. And it's like, I'm transported as a kid back in the 80s. Like, okay, now I have to watch next week's to see what happens. You don't have the cliffhangers. And I think what made this match so special between the Warrior and the Macho Man is, one, Macho Man's a guy that had tremendous athleticism. I mean, the guy could wrestle. He was great on the mic, and he was a heel. And how, if you watch just like the interviews that, Mean Gene, for example, did with him, and they tried to talk to Elizabeth, it's like, well, why are you talking? You should be talking. And then here comes Elizabeth in her dress, and she's all quiet, didn't say word. You turned Macho face, then he turned heel, aligns with Sherry, one of the best heels in the business for a woman. And she never played a face that I remember. Then you've got the Warrior, who just comes running to the ring, and just the energy that he had behind that character of who he was, and just how he ran down, shook the ropes, and went like this, and we were all going crazy. And I think what made it so special is you had athleticism with a real life superhero in the Warrior with athleticism, and here's your match.
Yeah, I think the only two times when that I can honestly say that people weren't like, oh yeah, the bell had to ring, was this match in WrestleMania 6 with Hogan, because most of Warrior's matches, in my opinion, were just awful.
They were. Okay. Oh gosh, where to begin? And Danny, you brought up Dallas. As I said, I still actually have it. I should probably find some place to host it again. But I cataloged and nitpicked the entire Dallas series. So yeah, you can name any episode, and I can probably tell you exactly what happened.
Who shot JR?
The correct answer is Kristen Shepard, a guy in Louisiana, his wife Sue Ellen, and his friend Bum, the private investigator. But everybody thinks the cliffhanger thing was Kristen Shepard, his sister-in-law, who was having an affair with. But anyway, about cliffhangers, you're right. We don't have. I remember back in like 1997, in the Attitude Era, when watching Monday Night Raw, because that's basically all you would get, at that time on TV. But like, I needed a fix like every week. Like, I have to watch Steve Austin. What is he gonna do this week?
Exactly.
That and that just isn't here anymore. And Brandon, you raised a good point. WWE is trying to do it, and I think that they are. And I'm just kind of flabbergasted. Sometimes I see online people posting on Facebook. It's like, oh my God, what the hell is going on at Dynamite? It's like they're trying to tell us a story or something. And I'm just like, what the hell is wrong with you people?
Yeah.
Like, when I see comments like that, I just stop the world. I want to get off. It's just so crazy that people think that story just doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter to you as much. And I think I've said this on other shows to people who think that way. It does matter to you. But the difference is you can create the story in your own mind. Right? If I give you two guys on AEW, like if I tell you Orange Cassidy and Matt Taven, you can make that story up in your mind. You don't need a story to be told necessarily, because you're one of the 800,000 people who's going to watch every week. What about the other 5 million potential people who could be watching every week? Anyway, off my soapbox a little bit. This match, it's interesting. Earlier this year, when WWE was showing WrestleMania's, and I was sitting with my mom and we were watching, my wife and my daughter, who were not the least bit interested in wrestling at all, when this match came on, when we were watching WrestleMania 7, they were interested. They got it. They're like, oh gosh, what's that lady gonna do? Who's she? Like they could tell that something was going on. Just the way Elizabeth was in the audience, and she was so good. Like, she spent 5 years. That was her job, to just look anxious and worried, right? That's all she ever did, but she was so good at it. And this story is just universal. Even if you turn the sound off, you get it, right? And you could feel it. It's a man and a woman just kind of coming back together, and you can tell that there's something between them, and you want to see that embrace at the end, right? You don't have to explain this to anybody, right? It's just so universal. It reminds me of the time when Charlotte Flair, this might have been about 7-8 years ago, when she won her first women's championship on SmackDown. And at the end, she said, my dad couldn't be here. He's not feeling well and all that kind of stuff. And then in the end, as she's walking the back, Ric Flair comes out, right? And she goes up and gives him a big hug. One of my favorite moments. And anybody who has a daughter or a family or whatever, nobody has to explain that to you, right? You just get it. And when it's real, you feel it, right? And everybody could just feel it in this particular case, right? So perfect in every imaginable way and so universal. This kind of storytelling could bring in a lot of fans. I wish we could kind of capture that again somehow. Don't know how.
Yeah. So join us next week as we cover first 2 seasons of Dallas next week here.
Yeah.
But no,
I was very young when I watched it, so I want to go back and do some catch up.
But no, this story, I mean, this match alone, like you said, Amer, like all you guys said, it is that story and it is that soap opera. And watching this match and watching, the whole story unfold with Sherry turning on Randy because her meal ticket's off, to Elizabeth saving her man and Randy saving face, becoming a hero again. It's so, that's the connection to the crowd that I think we miss a lot as wrestling fans. We just want action. We want something. Some fans want the storyline. Most fans want the action and spots and big moves. But you've lost the touch of a story. And I kind of think of the episode, if you guys ever saw the show Glow on Netflix, there's that episode where the best friend, the blonde best friend, goes with them to a wrestling show to kind of understand what it is. And she's been on TV. She's a soap opera star. She's a dramatic actress. And so she's there. And as the guy, the one woman whose family is wrestling, basically explains the story between why these two male wrestlers hate each other and who the woman is. That's when it clicks for that actress. When she's like, wait a minute, this is a drama. This is drama. This is a show. And it kind of clicks. And that's the kind of story that most wrestling fans need to understand, that there's a reason behind why these two people are fighting or wrestling each other, and that's something I think AEW does need to work better on, is that storytelling.
Yeah, if you listen to a lot of the older guys when they're actually talking about AEW, there is nobody out there. I don't care who you talk of, old school guys, whether it be a Cornette, Bischoff, XYZ, that want AEW to fail.
Nobody
else. But they are critical of the product, and that's what I was getting to. Yeah, you can like the big moves, that's fine, but it's you're who in AEW, and correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I know I'm critical of their stuff right now, but the fans are invested in Swerve.
Yep.
Who else are they invested in? I mean, tell me. I mean, I just they have picked up and dropped the ball with Wardlow so many times.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, they have.
Yes, they have.
Now, whether he could go on to be something big, you don't know, but give the man a chance. Give him a good run and see what he can do. And if he drops the ball, that's on him. But they start and stop. I mean, Wardlow's not the only one they're doing it with. And there's just, like I said, you can have the big moves and, progressing in today's wrestling of what it's become, from just a headlock or hip toss or whatever the case may be. You can have those big moves, but wouldn't those big moves mean more if there was actually, oh my God, these guys hate each other because that's why he's putting his neck on the line to hurt this guy.
That's right.
Right.
I mean, that's just my opinion.
I think what you're trying to see and what they're pushing, but they kind of also dropped the ball on, is the Christian Adam Copeland Edge kind of feud going on, because it's I've seen this story before. It's almost like a rerun, if we're going to talk like it's soap opera, it's a rerun. It's because I've seen these guys feud in WWF over the Intercontinental title.
Well, not only that, but if you look at it as well, like to me, last night, what last night set up was a second 3-way match for another title at Revolution. I mean, they haven't announced it yet, but it looks like it'll be, Copeland versus Christian versus Danny Garcia for the TNT title. Now, I hope not too, because that's one of my biggest issues with AEW, and it's little stuff. It's like if you got a guy that comes out on the microphone, guy or girl that comes out, and they're really into their promo and they spit out a shit or a goddamn or something like that, but then 2 promos later, somebody else is doing it over again. Well, it just took away everything that the emotion and that guy did. Or, if in match number 1, if you got somebody going through a table, and in match number 3 and 4, they're going through a table as well. It just, it diminishes what you're doing. And it's like, like I said, there's going to be fluffer matches on any card, any promotion, and that's fine. But, stop letting them do this. Stop letting them do the same thing over and over again. If Swerve's going to put Hangman through a table, let the rest of the card know, hey, they're using tables tonight. You use something else.
Well, you have to have production meetings for that to happen.
Yeah,
right? You
get where I'm coming from, though.
I totally agree with you 100%. And you're right. And again, like talk just to kind of put it back to the crowd connection, there still is a crowd. You get Cody with the whoa and all that, and everybody sings Judas when Jericho comes out. Those little things can make a connection to the audience, not the way that they did back in this match, but it's still possible. Right? You can still do it. And it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot. Just
all right, but here's something for you. And I know we're getting off subject, but you brought up Jericho. Not last night, but a week ago on Dynamite. Mm-hmm. He's against Takeshita, who I like. I like Takeshita. Don't care for Don Callis too much, never have, but different story for a different day. But Callis hits Jericho with the screwdriver.
Yes.
That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, the way that finish should have went down was when he put him in the walls. Jericho, the referee grabs his arm, and Jericho's out because he got hit with a screwdriver.
Mm-hmm.
But yet he taps him out. I'm just like, come on, man, y'all can do better than that. Maybe that's just me. Maybe that's me being overcritical. But if you're going to hit the guy with something and beat him with his own move, he doesn't tap out. You hit him with something, let him lay there like he's knocked out.
Yeah, I agree. It's just little things that could be better. And to bring it back to what you said, a lot of guys are critical, but nobody wants to see AEW go out of business, no matter how critical they are. They just want it to be better. And I don't know if anybody else here has kids, but I understand that, right? If I'm critical of my child, who I love, because I think they can be better, I'm going to tell them that, right? I have one who I can be a little bit more critical of than I can of the other, but that's because I expect more of this one.
And you go back, with the kids, and that's another thing that I have an issue with AEW as well as, and it's not me because you say whatever you want when I'm listening, and I'm not going to get offended, but everybody wants AEW to start growing their audience. They did well at Wembley, and Sting's last match in the Carolinas, sold out quickly, but everywhere else they're having trouble drawing.
Yes.
But when you got, and I forgot what it might have been Wembley when Adam Cole and MJF went out, but and then Darby Allin being in California or whatever pay-per-view that was, screaming the F word over the microphone, and you've got parents in there with their kids at that going, we're never coming back to one of these.
Yeah.
And it's like I get you're trying to be edgier, but you can be edgier without going that far.
I agree. You're right. It doesn't take much to turn people off. It only takes once, right? Once they leave, they're not coming back. That's a problem.
Right. And talking about, this same old shtick, to close out WrestleMania 7, we get the classic Hogan wins the title from the bad guy shtick that we have seen many a times before, and we've seen since with other wrestlers. So like we talked about previously with WrestleMania 6 about the start of Hogan's ego kind of, okay, I'll put this guy over, but for the rest of the time, it's all about me. And that's basically what we see in this main event, the whole two against one kind of thing. And obviously Hogan coming out on top as WWF champion again, doing the whole put my belt on backwards and then spinning it around because that's what I do. The hulking up, being covered by the foreign flag. No, not in America, brother. This is where you kind of saw the ego and kind of saw it going forward in his career. By far, one of my least favorite main events of any WrestleMania was this one. I mean,
they had
to talk about it, but we had to because you had to send the crowd home happy.
You had to send the crowd home happy, but you also got to remember the Gulf War was happening, right? And there were little tidbits because I listened to this again from Bruce again that Royal Rumble was actually the night that America declared war, right? And so the WWE office are like, oh crap, now this is getting real, but they had already kind of committed to it, they were planning to have this in the LA Coliseum because they wanted it to be bigger than it was at the Sky Dome. They couldn't because of security reasons, right? Everything was very, very different. Once war had been declared, and the whole country, things changed. Interesting from what I heard from Bruce Prichard is this was not the original plan. They were actually planning to turn, of all people, Tugboat, Fred Ottman, Cody Rhodes' uncle, to turn on Hulk Hogan.
Shockmaster.
What's that?
Shockmaster.
Yeah, he was a Shockmaster as well. That's right. That was the original plan. And then Sergeant Slaughter kind of became available. And they're like, oh, wait a minute. He's G.I. Joe. Gosh, wouldn't that be cool? And they did it. And then they kind of worked themselves into shoot saying, oh, gosh, now we're really going to war, right? But they were just too far into it. They couldn't, they had already announced the match. They had built up the match. And this is what they had to do.
Yeah, I've listened to Slaughter talk about that time in his life and about how he had to have his wife and kids moved away from their house and put somewhere safe because, all the death threats they were getting and threats he was getting against his family. And, they kept it kayfabe. They never, they didn't, it wasn't long after that they wound up turning him back and getting him out of that gimmick. But yeah, he said it was pretty touch and go there for a little bit.
It was very tough.
Yeah. And Danny, for you too. I mean, for that, the Hogan ego coming out, and the whole blurring the line of, we're based this on a real event. Watching that growing up, how did that stick with you?
I'm seeing Sergeant Slaughter. I'm seeing Hogan. I'm seeing this match. And I have a little trivia question for you guys. We're going to go back to 1978. Who was Sergeant Slaughter wrestling as and where?
Was he in the AWA or is that before AWA?
AWA. You got it, Gamer.
Okay. Because I know he was in the AWA for a long time.
Uh-huh.
I did not watch the AWA in 78. I was 5.
Was he not performing as the Executioner?
No.
No, that was after, right?
Super Mark Destroyer with Lord Alfred Hayes. Look it up.
Oh my gosh.
Look up
Super Destroyer Mark II.
Yeah, go on YouTube and look up Lord Alfred Hayes, AWA. Here he comes. I'm like, I know that face. Where do I know that face from? And I looked up. I go, that's Sergeant Slaughter under a mask. There you go. I'm getting the mental visual of that. And I think what made just the whole idea work with that. And I find it interesting, Amer, that you're saying that they were going to turn Tugboat, Fred Ottman, into like a heel or whatever. I remember that. Now what would the Shockmaster have said about that? Would he have fallen like the Shockmaster in that role? Which was hilarious to begin with. But I think what made that just interesting too is that, again, you're taking a world event and bringing it into sports entertainment.
Yep.
And it's just like, okay, now what happens? Where do we go from here? And I find it interesting that Sergeant Slaughter, had to have, his wife and kids moved away for their safety. But again, if I remember correctly, we all hated Sergeant Slaughter back then because we've got the heel Sergeant Slaughter, or as what HBK used to refer him as Chin or something back when he was commissioner, back when DX was around. But we never cared for him. We hated him back then, but we embraced Hogan because of, the prayers, the vitamins, the pythons, and everything else.
The American way. I mean, that's just what it was. And, you know, whatever you want to say about Hogan and his ego, and there's no doubt the man has a gigantic ego, you know, Vince McMahon's an enabler as far as that goes. Let's leave other topics aside. But you know what? Vince is like, this guy is my meal ticket. You know,
I'll tell you, you know, two things about that. With Sergeant Slaughter, I never liked him as a G.I. Joe. Growing up with Crockett.
I didn't either, personally.
Well, growing up with Crockett, he was an amazing heel in the NWA as the U.S. champion and part of the World Tag Team Champions with Don Coronado. He was a fantastic heel.
Sergeant Slaughter was in NWA.
Yes, he was. Early 80s.
I don't remember him in NWA.
Yep, he was in Crockett. He was one part of the NWA World Tag Team Champions with Don Coronado. That's when Jim Nelson was with him as the privates. And then he was also the United States heavyweight champion there. But you talk about Hulk Hogan's ego. I don't want to say I saw it so much here, but I told you I never liked him. And then in the Royal Rumble before WrestleMania 8, that's where his ego to me started the show. And when because the Royal Rumble was always advertised, it has been since day one, every man for himself. You know, don't turn your back. It's every man for yourself, partner versus partner, every scenario in the world they've used. And, you know, Sid did nothing wrong. Sid just dumped him out of the ring. And then his ego couldn't handle it. And because I remember watching that Royal Rumble going, look at this sore loser. Look at this asshole. He's trying to jerk Sid out of the ring.
Yeah.
And that's when, you know, when he's jerking Sid is when Flair is able to run over there and tip Sid out and win the title. But that's when they really, to me, started letting Hogan's ego show on TV.
Yeah. And that's actually great before we move on, because that's going to segue into what we get at WrestleMania 8. But before we move on, do Amer or Brandon, do you guys have any tidbits about WrestleMania 7?
There wasn't a whole lot that I saw there that wasn't that people wouldn't know.
I can just say one thing. I don't know how many people know this, but Sheikh Adnan Al-Kaisi, who again goes back with Sergeant Slaughter a long way back into the AWA.
AWA, yeah, him I remember.
Yeah, was actually a childhood legit shoot friend of Saddam Hussein.
That I have read that. Yep.
They grew up together. They went to school together. And a story that I heard was that at one point, you know, Sheikh Adnan convinced Andre the Giant, hey, let's go to Baghdad and let's put on a wrestling show. You know, my buddy rules the country. You know, we'll make some money, and what could go wrong? And then when he came back to the States, he's like, yeah, I'm never going back there again. So
I feel like we should be taking between Amer's history lessons and Brandon's tutorials. I feel like I should be taking notes, and there's a
yeah, we'll send you some transcripts.
I mean, between all three of us, Danny, I mean, because you said you learned a lot from me as well, which is weird.
I know. My God. Yeah, I said, okay, I'm going to go on record and say, Connor, I love you. I said 2 weeks ago I'm in love with Adam, and I am. I said 2 weeks ago I was in love with Amer. Now I just fell in love with Brandon. Oh my God!
You have too many men to keep a track of.
I know. And then there's Wardlow.
Yeah, well, Wardlow's gonna have to take a back seat at some point.
And then there's Wardlow, and then I've got Starks. And again, I showed my nanny kid. I'm like, I showed her my phone. I'm like, who's that? And she's like, Wardlow. And I'm like, who's my favorite? And she goes, Wardlow, Starks. So she knows.
We'll have to have like an elimination chamber or something.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, that leads us, obviously, the story of the Royal Rumble leading us to WrestleMania 8, which actually was shown live from the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is now known as the RCA Arena, I believe. Mm-hmm. And this card was definitely an interesting, fun one. Obviously, you had a lot of returnees. Obviously, the return of Randy Savage to face the man, Ric Flair for the WWF title. Woo! But also, this had, again, not a single women's match on the card. So as the card goes, it started out with Shawn Michaels in his solo run after breaking up with the Rockers.
The debut of the Boys Boy.
Yeah, with Sensational Sherry. Sensational Sherry moves on to the next one with against Tino Santana. Then you had The Undertaker wrestle Jake Roberts. As a babyface, exactly, which is crazy. Bret Hart wrestled Roddy Piper, and by far what I thought which I thought was by far the best Intercontinental Championship match on a card.
And have y'all ever heard Roddy Piper's take on that match?
I don't think
I've heard some things, yes. I can't remember specifics, but
before I continue the card, why don't we delve into that real quick?
Well, no, it was just funny because, a lot of people were like, oh my God, Hogan would never drop the title to Piper. And a lot of that was Piper. He didn't want to win it because he knew he would have to lose it.
Correct.
And he fighting for that. That was not Hogan. That was Piper. Yeah. And, Hogan has said several times that they could have made so much more money if they'd have, flip-flopped the title back and forth a couple of times. But Piper was so worried about his spot. And that was back in the day of, Piper was convinced if he laid down once, that would be the end of the feud. So he refused to do it. But, he finally agreed to take the Intercontinental title, knowing he would have to drop it. And he had, at the end of this match, he had Bret in the sleeper. And, Bret does the feet on the ropes and flips over for the 1, 2, 3. And when Piper was talking about it, I forgot what interview it was. He's like, well, technically, I still had the offensive hold on and the referee shouldn't have counted. I didn't lose that match. And, but he laughed about it and said, that he loved Bret and he didn't have any issues doing that for Bret. So.
And Amer, we actually mentioned that on the live Tuesday show for Canada about our picks for people who should have been champs, and Roddy Piper was one. And we both mentioned that is because you would have had to take the belt off of him. And
he didn't want it, and it would have been tough. And one thing, I actually found a review of this on YouTube where they have, the bulk of the match. And when that spot happens, when you see Bret going into the ropes, there's one guy, you can see him like on the hard cam, and he's just like, oh no. He knows what's going to happen because apparently he had seen that spot before, or he just had this premonition that, oh my God, Piper's going to lose, no. And it's hilarious watching him. It's kind of like the guy who's shocked when Undertaker loses at the streak at Brock Lesnar.
I think for a lot of people, that for Piper wise, a lot of people from the WWF era, didn't give him his due. They didn't think he could wrestle. They thought he could just fight. He was just a brawler. And this was his way to go out there and show them, hey, I know what the hell I'm doing. I just choose not to. You could go back and watch his early NWA stuff, the stuff he did with Flair, an amateur wrestling skit he did with Flair on 605 show one night when he went out there and amateur wrestled Flair out of his suit in the middle of the ring. The matches he had with Valentine, of course, the dog collar match is famous and it was brutal, but Piper could wrestle. He just chose not to.
He needed motivation, right? For Bret Hart, I'll do it. For Valentine, I'll do it.
But like I said, this was his showcase to go out there and go, okay, watch what I can do.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the rest of the
by far, that was the best match on the card to me.
Yes, and the rest of the card kind of fills out as is Big Boss Man, Virgil, Sergeant Slaughter, and Jim Duggan against the Mountie Nasty Boys and Repo Man, or AKA formerly known as Smash in Demolition.
Right. And
Randy Randy Savage wrestling Ric Flair in a very entertaining match, as I would say, obviously, for the WWF Championship, which I believe was Randy Savage's last WWF Championship.
Well, and we were kind of mentioned that when we were talking about Kerry Von Erich and the Texas Tornado. I'll give the WWF its due. They did their, for all the guys they brought in from Crockett that they kind of buried and changed their name and didn't do anything for them. They tried their damnedest to push Ric Flair.
Yeah,
and with the title, the real world champion, and it was no fault of his. He was still Ric Flair, no fault of the company. But like you guys were talking about, a lot of those WWF people didn't know who the hell Kerry Von Erich was. A lot of those people were going, why is this guy calling himself the real world champion? Who is he? And they actually had him and Hogan on a run of house shows as the main event. And it didn't do anything. And they're like, we can't have this at WrestleMania. The crowd wasn't into the matches. And that's why it got changed at the last minute. Cause you could put Flair and Savage together in an empty arena, or, probably, if Savage was still around, even in their 70s, and go out there and have a better match than half the people that are out there today could. And put Hogan against Sid because of what happened at the Royal Rumble. But again, they tried, they did their due. They dropped the Nature Boy gimmick there for a while, which I rolled my eyes at, but they still pushed him and made him out to be a big star, and the audience just didn't bite.
Right. Yeah. And then the rest of the card was Tatanka versus Rick Martel, Natural Disasters against Money Inc., Owen Hart's WrestleMania debut as the Rocket, Owen Hart against Skinner, and then of course main event against Hulk Hogan against Sid Justice.
Now you were talking about Chic Tugboat. Now, was Typhoon any better?
Typhoon, who wins?
That's the Shockmaster on Flair for the Gold.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Now one of the biggest stories I take from this card is basically what they call a co-main event, yet the WWF Championship was not the main event. Of course, Hogan was the main event in this
Hogan
card.
must close.
And Hogan must close.
Yep.
So for me, that kind of diminished a little bit of this card for me, just because of that. And I kind of want to get your guys' take on the disaster, which was that main event.
Well, I mean,
yeah, okay. I know.
If anybody is not familiar, I will explain it to the crowd, the listeners out there who's not familiar with the original planned finish of that match, what we actually got. So in the middle of the match was supposed to still end with Hogan getting disqualification win. However, it was supposed to be leg drop, and before he can get the finish, Papa Shango was supposed to come out at a certain point to cause the disqualification. Now, at some point, Papa Shango, who later went on to become the Godfather, at some point missed the cue to go out there. So they had to improvise to where Harvey Whippleman came in and caused the disqualification, and actually Sid kicked out. And he wasn't supposed to kick out. He was supposed to be saved by Papa Shango, but it was a miscue and everything like that. So that's pretty, if I'm on par on what that was originally supposed to be, please correct me if I was a little off.
No, that sounds about right.
So I kind of want to get everybody's take on it.
Yeah, Papa Shango, like the Godfather has said, he's been pretty consistent with his story that he was ready, but he was relatively new to the WWF at the time, right? So he was at Gorilla, he was waiting for his cue, and it wasn't given to him at the right time, right? And he's been pretty consistent in saying that, and he said that, look, if it was my mistake, I would have got reamed, I would have got fired by Vince McMahon like right away. Come on. Right? Somebody missed their cue and they copped to it, and that's why I still stayed employed. So I tend to believe him on that. And the other part of that is, of course, to chase Papa Shango away, the Warrior came in after him. So, and then that was supposed to set up a whole bunch of other stuff. But yeah, this, WWE was the land of the giants. I'll just say what I had to say about the match, and then we'll pass it on. But it was still the land of the giants, and the Hogan Flair thing at house shows didn't work. And, they went with kind of the safe bet, Hogan against the big monster. And in the end, Hogan must pose, and that's what always works. So this is what we're going to do. And that's what I had to say about this match.
And then Sid had to go play softball. So he
Yeah, and that's the thing with this is, again, we saw only... For us, we all agree that the one good match on this card was that Bret Hart Roddy Piper match. But we can't deny the fact that it was nice to see Randy Savage get one more run with the WWF title before he ultimately went to doing commentary and doing all the backstage stuff and all that stuff before he revitalized his career in WCW.
Yeah, it was a good match too. The Savage Flair match was not bad, but it just turned kind of a mess towards the end with Mr. Perfect getting involved, then Elizabeth getting involved. It seemed disjointed towards the end to me.
Yeah, Danny, I want to get your take on that too. Out of all the matches we talked about this card, out of any of those matches we talked about, is there another match or any of those matches that stick with you from this card?
I would have to say, and I'm getting a mental visual of this card in general. Forgive me, it's the cold medicine that I've been on for 4 days, or maybe it's 5. I don't know. I'm getting a mental visual of this match, and at this point, I would say probably the Hogan Sid match probably stands out more. And at this point, I personally was over Hogan. I mean, I was just over him. Hogan was back then what John Cena was for everybody circa 2006, 2007, 2008. Hogan was back then for kids what Cena was 10 years ago when I was at Payback and I'm yelling John Cena sucks and I'm the only person while a little girl next to me is cheering for John Cena and Charmiata Gold bracelets. I was over Hogan, and as I'm getting the mental visual, I can definitely see where Brandon's saying that his ego was showing, because again, it's all about and this. And Sid was a legit monster. If Sid would have been booked properly, you didn't know if the guy was a face, you didn't know if he was heel, you didn't know if he was sticking with the full deck, you didn't know if he was a hamburger short of the Happy Meal type thing. If Sid was booked better, Sid could have been a legit monster. He could have stayed with WWE longer if he was booked right in WCW. Hello, leg jump, broken leg. Let's let a 6'10" guy jump off the top rope and land wrong. He could have
second rope. It's yeah.
Well, I'll say this for Sid. They both companies booked him about as well as they could, because he was a hamburger short of a Happy Meal.
Yes, he was.
You did not know what you were going to get with that guy. You didn't know when he was just going to call you and say, "Yeah, I'm going to take the next 4 months off and play softball."
And there was just something in his eyes. If you watch some of those old episodes of Raw back like in 97, I'm now on, I think 90. What am I on now? I'm on 98. So if you watch like some of those old episodes of Raw, you could just see something behind those eyes.
Yeah.
As to who Sid Udi, I think I said it right, Udi or Udi is.
Yeah.
And there's just something about him.
But he could crack at any minute. Any second he could crack and turn on you, and he would just stop you with no mercy. Absolutely.
Yeah, he's a hamburger short of the Happy Meal and the Diet Coke that they forgot to give you too with him.
Yeah.
You know, the reason he got that last title run he got in WWF was because it wasn't supposed to be him. It was supposed to be Vader. And Michaels did not want to work with Vader. So they gave that spot to Sid, and he got a couple month title, 2-month title run out of it because Shawn didn't want to work with Vader. So
it's amazing how you see that too.
Yeah, he was a monster. He was, and he had a great look, and his facial expressions were great because, like you said, you didn't know what he was going to do. But the guy was a flake behind the scenes, so they couldn't keep him on top, but for so long because they didn't want to have to explain to the audience why their top draw just
why he's playing softball. Oh
yeah.
And I will tell you, when Hogan went to WCW in 94.
Yeah.
After those first 2 or 3 matches and the audience were booing him out of the building, it really warmed my heart.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the funny thing after we get done with these next two, the last 2 WrestleManias we're covering, but yeah, no, the fact that Sid had the career that he had, and because he had to fill in for someone that didn't want to work with somebody else, and it's so crazy how that's changed over the last couple of years when it comes to working with each other in a promotion. Obviously, we see the bad side of it, i.e. Punk and the Bucks and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But then we see the good side of it of, Seth Rollins working with Matt Riddle and Cody Rhodes, even though he was willing to work with Punk too, because he had legit heat with all these guys, but he was willing to work for them. That's a huge difference of when you see back in the day when, hey, I don't want to work with this guy. And it was like, all right, cool. We're not going to work with you then. And you guys can have heat for the rest of your lives. We don't care.
Are you talking about the Vader Shawn Michaels issue?
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless they buried the hatchet with it.
It was a little bit different because, and again, not to get too far off track, but Vader had gone through the issue he had with Paul Orndorff. That's why he had to leave WCW. And came to WWF at the time, right? And by all accounts, he was really not the same guy. He had lost a lot of self-confidence and that sort of thing. And Shawn Michaels was not the nicest person in the world at the time, no question about that. But I think there were some kind of legitimate gripes about Vader not being what he advertised himself to be and what he was advertised to be.
And another knock he got then was that he wasn't very hygienic. I mean, it's been stated that when he was there that, so the guys said they had a routine. They would get done, go back to their room, put their tights in water, soap them out, hang them up to dry, then go out to the bar, do whatever they were going to do for the night. And Vader just apparently, I've heard Jim Ross talk about it. I've heard several people, that one of Shawn's gripes with Vader was that he stunk.
He wasn't the only one. Yeah.
And that his gear stunk. And, Jim Ross in one of the interviews said he tried to talk to him. He said, I tried to talk to Leon about it, but he acted like he couldn't understand what I was telling him.
Yeah. And it's really a shame. I don't know how much of a problem it was in WCW. I have a feeling that it was. But at least in WCW, Vader had Harley Race with him, right? To kind of be his handler and his manager behind the scenes. And, hell, even Andre the Giant was scared of Harley Race, right? So if Vader got out of line, Harley would smack him one, right? That, at least those kind of stories that I heard. Had Harley come with him to the WWF, things might have been different. He might have been able to kind of keep him in line and, make him understand, Leon, this is what you got to do, So who knows what might have happened.
Right.
I'm horrified by that story of Stinky Tights. That's going to sit with me the rest of the night, just like when I picked up poop with my bare hands off a classroom floor of 1-year-olds.
Oh, yeah. You could tell us that story before, and I still am not a fan of it.
And I was like, wait, what happened? I'm like, whoa. Okay, that was it. There you go.
Before we move,
like a shitty day.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Exactly.
But before we move on to the next one, Brandon, do you have any tidbits for WrestleMania 8?
No, not really. Like I said, Flair and Savage could have been better, but it was what it was. If they would have just sent the two of them out there to have a wrestling match, you might not have got the caliber match as you had with Steamboat and Savage, but you could have come close. Yeah. But it was, by this time we were into a lot of gimmicks. Yes. They had moved away from some of the stuff that they were trying to be more mainstream, more gimmicky, which had all the outside interference. And, like I said, Hogan and Sid to close out the show, whatever cluster that it turned out to be, no matter whose fault it was. You're not, if you got those guys, Sid could have a good match with the right guy. Hogan could have a good match with the right guy, but they were not the guy to lead the other one. And that's kind of why you ran into what you ran into.
Yeah.
Right. Amer, and how about you? Any facts towards the end here for WrestleMania 8?
No, I think we covered it. I guess, I don't know. The only thing I'll throw out there in case anybody kind of hasn't heard it, it's not directly related to WrestleMania 8, but kind of leading into it because we had some talk about, the real world champion and Ric Flair coming over with the belt. One of the things that had confused me for a very, very long time is how in the heck did that happen? How did Ric Flair leave Crockett, which was WCW at that time, by the belt? Brandon, I'm not sure. Have you heard this story?
Yeah, I'll you can jump in, but the way it was for the NWA back in the day, the way they made sure that you would lose the title when they said it was time was you had to put a $25,000 deposit on the belt.
Correct.
And when your time was up, they would give you, when you lost the belt, once you went and laid down for the 1, 2, 3, or you submitted to somebody and they put the belt on the next person, i.e. Terry Funk, Jack Briscoe, Harley Race, Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, whoever, Kerry Von Erich, then they would give you back that $25,000 deposit plus interest. However long you held the title, they would give, it was like putting in a savings account.
Right.
And when they told Rick to give the belt back, he's like, all right, well, bring me my money. And Jim Herd was like, F you. And he's like, well, F you. And, and they sent Doug Dillinger to get the belt, and him and Flair were friends. And, Doug knocked on his door and they kind of had a conversation. He's like, you're not getting it. He goes, yeah, I know. I just came to say it. Came over. So, Flair had the belt, and that's when he said he called Vince and said, I'm coming this time. I've got the belt. He goes, you know what? Send me the belt, and I'll believe you this time. He
right.
Goes, okay.
Yeah, because he'd done that before. The only other wrinkle.
FedExed in the belt, and the rest is history.
Yep. The only other wrinkle that I hadn't heard, and this is when Conrad had a conversation, he actually found Jim Herd and talked to him about it. The interesting thing about it is that Rick had paid that deposit, but he had paid it to the NWA. Right? Back when the NWA, I don't remember exactly when he won the belt, but I think it was like 89 or 90. He had it for a couple of years, I think, or at least long enough. And he had paid it to the NWA, which by the time this rolled around in 1991 and this became an issue, the NWA didn't really exist. Like, they had a president in name only, which is kind of like how they were before I think Billy Corgan bought it or whoever bought it. And so when he went to Jim Herd, he said, you didn't pay me $25,000. I don't have $25,000 in a bank account. Where am I supposed to get it from? You didn't pay us, Rick. Why are you asking us for the money? Right? And that became kind of part of the issue too, which probably Rick didn't hear because he was just demanding his money, when he told the story. So it turned into that kind of cluster because, I don't have your money. He has your money. Go get it from him.
Well, on the flip side of that, though, Ted Turner's got money. He had money then. He's got money now.
No doubt. Yeah, you're not wrong.
To keep the belt and to keep that from happening, because Ted was very aware of the WWF. He wanted to compete with the WWF. If Hurd would have just went to Turner and said, "Look," and just laid it out for him, Rick wants this money to give us this belt back. What do you want me to do? Ted would be like, "Here, give him his damn money. Get the belt."
Probably. But it turned into a pissing contest between them, no doubt. There's no question about that. But I just thought that wrinkle was kind of interesting. Like, Rick, you didn't pay us. Like, why are you asking us for it? But anyway, you're right. It could have been worked out. But
well, in Rick's defense, he paid somebody, so he was keeping what he paid for.
Absolutely. I'm behind him on that. Yeah. Anyway, let's
from one interesting WrestleMania to the next, we are into probably one of my least favorite, I think also goes across the board for a lot of people's least favorite WrestleMania. This was panned by a lot of people, and where do you start with it?
With good
this
reason.
was WrestleMania 9, broadcasting from Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas in 1993. But boy, oh boy, was this whole pay-per-view a mess. Honestly, I did not like this WrestleMania.
No, I was looking at the match card earlier going, oh God, I remember this.
I didn't even watch the pay-per-view because I remembered it. Because I remember looking at the match card going, yeah, I'm not going to watch this WrestleMania on Peacock. I'm going to skip this because I can't with this card. The only match I can think that was a highlight for me was probably none of them. I'm sorry. I honestly couldn't pull one match from this card that I found entertaining. Possibly maybe only the beginning one, which was Tatanka versus Shawn Michaels. That was probably the most interesting match to me, but I couldn't get behind this card.
Well, I was going to start there because if you go back even before the Rockers broke up, Shawn Michaels had wrestled Ric Flair on a Superstars or a Challenge and had a hell of a match. That's where the kind of dissension with him and Jannetty kind of started, because Jannetty tried to do something and Michaels had put his foot up on the rope and Jannetty backed into it and knocked his leg off the rope and Flair got the pin. But Chris Chavis was a good wrestler. Him and Michaels could have had a good match, and Michaels, you're trying to get him over as the Intercontinental Champion and push into the next level, and you do a count out with Tatanka.
Yeah. And the match was good up until that point.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's just the wrong call.
Yeah. And then you go down to the next one. This was Samu and Fatu, the SST Samoan SWAT team that was having fabulous matches with the Steiner brothers in WCW, had battles with the Road Warriors, and they bring them over as the head shrinkers and make them look like idiots. When they honestly could have had the second coming of Alpha and Sika if they really wanted to. But instead of promoting them like monsters like they did Alpha and Sika, we got what we got out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't even leave off one of the worst disasters of this pay-per-view, which was The Undertaker against Giant Gonzalez.
I was trying to skip over that one.
I understand, but it's one of those things we have to talk about because it is one of those WrestleMania matches of Undertaker that you could have thought would have went well, but was just a disaster. Based on the suit that Johnny Gonzalez was wearing.
I was just going to say that.
It was almost like he was naked. And George Gonzalez was a big dude. He was a big dude, and that suit did not work for him.
Do you remember where he came from?
Was he part of World Championship Wrestling?
He was.
Yeah, that's where he got his start. But the reason he started wrestling was, he came to America to play basketball for the Hawks when Ted Turner owned them, and he hurt his knee and was no longer able to play basketball. And Ted was like, well, hey, I got this wrestling company. You're a big dude. You want to do it?
Ted.
And
of course.
God, I cannot remember what he wrestled by in WCW.
He was El Gigante.
El Gigante. There you go.
And one of the commentators would speak. I forget which one. Speaking quickly, called him elegante. It's like there's nothing elegant about this guy. Come on.
And he would come out there and do this. He would like, Ric Flair, I want the belt. And I'm like,
Jim Ross told that story. It's like, okay, Jorge, let's get a promo. It's like, come on, do this, and he's like, Ric Flair, I kill you. And Jim Ross is like, okay, we got it.
No.
No. Jim Ross realized at the time that that's the best promo we're going to get out of this guy. Just run with it.
Yeah. And that's why in WWF he had Harvey Whippleman. Harvey Whippleman was one of the better managers he had over in WWF, So But man, what a disaster of a match, and just for it to end in disqualification. It was the dumbest decision you can write for an Undertaker match in history of pro wrestling.
Bruce Baker says that even to this day, Undertaker is mad at him about that. Like, he gives him dirty looks anytime he thinks about that match.
I'm getting the mental visual of, the Togas and, Jim Ross's debut. Let's remember, it was Jim Ross's WWE debut. Yeah. So we love Jim Ross.
The biggest toga party in history.
Yeah, there you go. And I'm just getting the mental visual of the Undertaker in that god-awful suit. Adam, I was thinking it as you were speaking it. That was just hideous. I mean, I've seen the Kardashians have better on, and we know the Kardashians have Halloween confused with the rest of the calendar because they have a mask on every day. I've seen the Kardashians look better.
Compared and he came out with that vulture, remember?
That whole match, I'm getting, again, the mental visual of that. I was just like, oh, great.
Like that's Jenna Maraska Charmel bad. Yeah.
And can we talk about the comedy moment of that pay-per-view, which is Bobby Heenan riding a camel? That was probably the highlight. Yes. That was the funniest part, the best part of the whole pay-per-view. Was,
besides his connection to the audience, they say one of the reasons The Undertaker was able to sustain so long was in those early years, he never complained. He just went out and did what they asked him to do and made the best out of it and never opened his mouth.
Yeah.
And he gained a lot of respect for doing that.
Yeah, he always had us, and I heard that too, Brandon, that he's always had a very strong work ethic and a strong leadership presence too. Yeah. Because he never complained.
Yeah. And I feel like we all just want to skim past this pay-per-view. So let's finish up this pay-per-view with the one more thing that we hated during that run. Hulk Hogan. Always having to end with Hulk Hogan being the hero. Here comes Hogan returning. Oh my God, Brett. Oh, are you good? He's gonna go get the title. Go get the title. Blah blah blah. I won the title. Look at me.
Well, I will say
I'm your hero.
And normally over the years you'll hear people kind of change their story on something, but Hogan and Bret Hart both are adamant about this pay-per-view. Bret said his biggest issue with Hogan was he knew it was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then the plan was that Hogan was supposed to put him back over.
Yes.
And Hogan says, that is not what Vince McMahon told me. He told me that I was going to go out there, take the title the way I took it because they wanted me on the overseas tour as a champion to be able to put people in the seats. And then I was going to come back and drop it back to Yokozuna. He said, dropping it to Bret was never brought to me at all. And both of them have been very adamant about their two sides of that story. Bret saying Vince told him that Hogan would drop it to him. Hogan said that was never presented to me.
Yep. I think Vince played them both. And I think Vince thought he could get whatever he wanted out of them. Hogan did not go on that European tour. He went back to making movies. I think this time was Mr. Nanny or whatever the heck it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
No Holds Barred. That was the one I was trying to think of last week.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. No Holds Barred was a few years before.
Yeah. We were talking about wrestling movies. I couldn't think of that first one that Hogan did. I couldn't.
But I when I was listening to this on the Bruce Baker podcast and all things, I'm like, man, again. History doesn't repeat itself, but boy, does it rhyme. Look at what we're having right now. Here's a guy coming back. His movie career is not so great, but he's got a lot of stroke. And, hey, I'm here. Let's do something with me. And you've got a guy standing over here saying, hey, I was promised stuff. What's going on? I got a story here. I got to finish. Bret Hart didn't use that verbiage, but that's kind of what we were doing here, right? And here's the promoter or, the company, the corporation saying, oh, yeah, we got to get some mileage out of this guy. We got to get some money out of this guy.
Well, I don't have an issue with anything they've done. Except the only thing that I don't know if he just worded it wrong or they actually backtracked because of the fan backlash from it. But when Cody come out and was confronted Roman on SmackDown and told him he was going to, he was taking the title, but he wanted to take everything, but it just wouldn't be at WrestleMania.
Those 4 words.
Yeah. And like I said, I don't know if he just they backtracked or something. He said wrong or what? How?
No, I think he said exactly what he was told to say, and they pivoted. Other than those 4 words, I think that this has been awesome.
Oh yeah, I won't call it a press conference because there was no press asking questions.
It was a kickoff event.
That thing they did last Thursday. I mean, I think Bayley got slighted because she was the women's winner for the Royal Rumble. But Rhea Ripley and Becky, with Becky telling Mommy was going to learn what it meant to be a bottom, I giggled over that. I thought that was pretty comical. And then the whole thing with Roman, Seth, The Rock, and Cody, I thought came off real well. And then the end of it with Triple H and The Rock, Triple H can't wrestle, so I'll be interested to see where this is going.
Anticipation, right?
After the shots that Triple H took at The Rock on the mic Friday night last week, I'm interested to see what The Rock will come back with, because Triple H cannot wrestle. He said he's done.
Yeah, I mean, he could, but he's not as dumb as Ric Flair. He's not going to do it.
Well, I mean, I don't know if any of y'all saw when he came back or was getting ready to come back, he did the interview with Stephen A. Smith. And Stephen A. Smith asked him, that was one of the questions. He goes, "So, are you just working us here, or are you actually retired?" He goes, "Man, I have a defibrillator in my chest, and getting zapped on live TV would not be the greatest thing for our product."
Yeah.
He goes, "So I'm done." And I really enjoyed it. Like the last Thursday, I was besides Bayley getting slighted as the Royal Rumble winner for the women, I thought it all came off pretty well.
So obviously, we kind of skated by WrestleMania 9 because I think a lot of us all agree, if not all of us agree, that is probably the worst of the worst. But do we have any interesting facts from that pay-per-view?
Facts, no, but I will say, if you look at one of the matches, I was a big Kurt Hennig fan. Lex Luger, I could take or leave. I do think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, and I'm hoping with Triple H in charge of creative that we get some of the guys and girls that hadn't been put in yet or been looked over, that with Triple H being such a fan of old school wrestling, that we finally get some of those people put in the Hall of Fame. It was a tragedy what happened with Lex Luger and Miss Elizabeth, but it wasn't like, it wasn't a Benoit situation where he actually killed her. She overdosed. He was high as a kite himself from what I've heard. But Lex both companies, they would push him to the moon, and the guy just could not, he could not take that ball and run with it.
Yes.
No matter how much either, the NWA, before it became WCW, then WCW, and then the WWF, then back to WCW. I mean, I think his best run was his final run in WCW. But I mean, the guy looked like $1 million, but he just, every time he got the ball, he just fumbled it.
Yeah. So moving on, we're going to finish up here on WrestleMania 10, which for the first time ever, one of the first times ever, no Hogan. So we're clear of that. But for me, this was one of my favorites. I think WrestleMania 10 was a lot of people's favorite pay-per-view. A lot of good matches. This one came from Madison Square Garden, the legendary Madison Square Garden. This was the first pay-per-view that Vince McMahon actually did commentary on for WrestleMania. And he was joined by Jerry Lawler. So it was an interesting combo. We, get to see that combo of commentary for a while. But also, again, in New York, and you had celebrities. You had celebrities like Donnie Wahlberg from New Kids on the Block. Burt Reynolds came out and did some announcing. But this card in general just was a really good card. And there was a return of a women's match. Even though it only lasted about 3 minutes, we got a female women's match on a pay-per-view, on a WrestleMania. Obviously, the big story coming out of this one was Bret Hart opening the pay-per-view and closing the pay-per-view.
And this was also coming off the Royal Rumble with the photo finish of Bret Hart and Lex Luger.
Bret Hart and Lex Luger, exactly, where they both get the challenge for the title. So out of this entire card, and I'll go around, we'll start with Brandon, then Danny, then Amer, sorry, I always mispronounce names. But we'll go through, out of this card, which match did you just enjoy the most?
The best wrestling match on the card was the first one. There's you can't touch that first one as far as wrestling goes. Mm-hmm. For me, the entertainment of the pay-per-view was the ladder match. You hadn't seen it before. It was the first. Several people, Scott Hall was not a slouch in the ring when he wanted to be. But this was a Shawn Michaels show. A lot of people said Shawn Michaels right there had a match with a ladder. And, but those two matches, I mean, like, Yokozuna, and he was better than the Giant Gonzalez, but he was another one of, kind of like in the same boat as Andre with me. There's only so much you can do with a guy that big. You're not going to get a whole lot out of it. I was not a big fan of Men on a Mission. Johnny Polo, there we go, Raven.
Yes.
Looking at that, I mean, there's some of these, Alundra Blaze, Medusa in the women's match, retaining the title. Randy Savage getting a match with Crush. I was not a big Bryan Adams fan. Bam Bam Bigelow and Luna Vachon versus Doink and Dink.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that match, but I don't.
I think if you ask Connor would say we need to bring back Dink the Clown. I think Connor's a big fan of Doink, Dink, and Dick, is what he says.
Dink against Marina Shafir. What do we have to say about that?
Yeah, I was
definitely
waiting
the
for that
match
to
that
come
Connor
up.
would love to have that on.
Dink probably weighs more than
Marina.
No, not Marina. The other one. What's the little Asian girl they have?
Riho?
Yes, Riho. Thank
Riho.
you.
Her name is Riho.
I mean, she looks like she's 4'11" and 85 pounds.
She's 4'11". I think she's 5'1". And like 95.
Danny, for you, what some of the stuff that stood out for you on this card?
For me, I think the first thing that stood out was the Hitman versus Owen, largely because you were both trained in that dungeon. You were both trained by the same person, yet you also had your individual styles. And what I think also, again, what was it? This was in 94. And again, 5 years later, I hate to say it, but Owen was gone. So this was just really, I think, what cemented Owen as a superstar, while Brett was embarking on that singles career at having had been part of a tag team for so long.
It opened with a story and it finished with a story. Because if you remember, once Brett defeated Yokozuna, everybody's out in the ring with him, lifting him up on his shoulders, and Owen walked about halfway down and just staring. And they're like, "Come on, man, come on!" And he's got the death stare, looking at Brett, because he knew, kayfabe wise, he knows that he pinned that guy earlier in the match. That title should be on his shoulder, not
his
Brett.
shoulders. Yep. And that's the beauty of it. It just continues the story of it. Amer, how about you?
Yeah, same thing. And again, you're finishing on a cliffhanger. Just that look, right? We've already alluded to the show Dallas, and a lot of the times, on my website, I would comment about at the end they would always have this kind of like freeze frame, on one person, and the look that they have on their face, and you're like, oh, okay, what's going to happen now? And that's how WrestleMania 10 ended, with that look on Owen's face. This guy's going to do something, and he's thinking, right? And yeah, Brett made Owen that night, and I'm sure he was like, if you were to ask him, he'd probably say that's probably one of his favorite matches for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I think for me that definitely is the match. Just because everybody here and everybody that watches knows I'm a huge Owen Hart mark. I honestly do believe that man could have been a world champion, should have been a world champion. Just sheer talent that kid had. Sure. And the story it told of him stepping out of the shadow of Brett, because Brett was that guy and Owen wasn't there yet. He wanted to be that. And that story at the end of him just staring at Brett with the title, and just going, that should be me. I beat you in that first match,
He didn't have to say a word, right?
No, he didn't have to say a word. It was just the word on his face with the eyes. The eyes told the story.
Correct.
Which is why it's so important to hear that expression. The eyes are the window to the soul.
And to me, I think the reason they ended it that way is if you look at the whole card from top to bottom, starting it with Owen and Brett, nobody on that card is. I'm sure they probably had it in the back of their mind, seeing Brett versus Owen, but watching it in the back, how they say it's a curtain sellout. Who wanted to follow that match? Nobody. And and by bringing Owen back out at the end, Brett versus Yokozuna was about as good as it could be, but that doesn't mean it was that great. Mm-hmm. And by bringing Owen back out, it brought you back to how good that match was to open the show and where we're going now. And it kind of erased all that stuff in the middle. I think the only two people that might not have worried about following that match was Razor and Shawn. And as good as they were without that ladder, they couldn't have followed it.
No.
Right.
No, you needed that gimmick match, that ladder match, just to have a little bit of a hot spot in the middle of that card. And my hat's off to that, because that was such an entertaining match. They both played their parts well. And just to see someone like Razor Ramon, Scott Hall go over like that, when for a few years they were pushing Shawn to be a singles guy and all this stuff, and just to have Razor just go over and win that basically claim to be the real Intercontinental Champion was just a beaut of its own. I think it's interesting when you see some of the people on this card. Obviously, you see Alundra Blaze, who goes on to WCW as I just forgot Medusa. Thank you, Medusa. But also, if you guys notice in the group chat while I was watching it, I sent you pictures of both Johnny Polo, like Brandon said, the Raven, but also one of the Quebecers, Quebecers was Pierre, who's now currently PCO.
And Jacques Rougeau.
Yes. So it's amazing to see some of the names on this card. And one that really stuck out, because it was his last televised match, actually, was Randy Savage. Randy Savage wrestling Crush in another gimmick match, the Falls Count Anywhere match.
But just speaking of Crush, Brian Adams, they didn't do anything with him after WCW was bought. But I actually liked Brian Clark and Brian Adams in WCW as Chronic. And then they
actually did. They came back for one match as Chronic, right? Against Undertaker and Kane, but it was horrible.
Exactly. So I mean, they were doing, to me, I was like, oh, when they first put them together, I'm like, well, they look good. Let's see what happens. And they did well in WCW, and then, like I said, they brought them over and they had that one match, and it was just horrible. But this card actually brings me to something. People have said over the years that Vince McMahon always took a lot of crap from Shawn Michaels because he would say, oh, he reminds me of me, especially when I was younger, blah, 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 blah. But this was really the first time you saw Shawn Michaels' ego, because he got suspended for steroids. If you remember, they told him to send the belt back, and he told him to kiss his ass. He wasn't sending the belt back. And instead of firing him like he probably would have 98% of the roster, maybe not a Brett or Undertaker or somebody like that, but the majority of the roster, he probably like, you don't want to send me my belt? No, bye. But he let Shawn come back, and they had done the battle royal where Scott Hall won the title and did the ladder match for the unification. But like, this was really the first time we saw Shawn Michaels throwing his attitude and his problems into TV.
Right. And that's the big thing too, is this was prime diva Shawn Michaels. Pretty much the post Hogan, you get Shawn Michaels' ego and his whole attitude backstage, basically becoming the golden boy. And we all know the story of the fallout between Brett and Vince after the Montreal screw job, and Shawn being shot to the moon, but then someone like a Stone Cold coming in. But yeah, no, this card obviously did show you that side of Shawn. And it's very sad to see that someone, has to have that ego and that attitude, when really it's everybody benefits from the card. And so I honestly think WrestleMania 10 was where you got to start seeing some good matches, some good storytelling. I think this is where you start seeing a shift in WWF going forward from this pay-per-view. But before we start winding down here with this pay-per-view, going around to Brandon and Amer, were there any tidbits from WrestleMania 10 that you guys have found out?
No, nothing. I don't think anybody else hadn't heard. I mean, for me personally, I'll say this: everybody else, when you get into the discussion of old school wrestling, people ask you, who you like better. Would you like Brett or Shawn better? And it's, to me, Brett was a much better professional wrestler. Shawn was more your Ric Flair. He could wrestle his ass off, but he was a much better entertainer, because Brett's mic skills, they were better than some, but not to the level of a Flair, a Michaels, a Hogan,
right,
to keep the audience intertwined like that. And and I think that's where his fail in WCW came, not the injury, of course, but where the WWF was so loaded at the time when he left that he didn't have to say much, and he could go out there and have those matches with an Austin or a Michaels. Yeah. And there was nobody really besides Flair in WCW to work with. Him and Benoit had that Owen tribute match, which is a hell of a match, and they both got through it. But other than that, Brett going to WCW, he didn't have that caliber of roster to continue to work with. And he was exposed in a lot of ways, in my opinion. Which, if Shawn Michaels would have been the one to go over there, the very well could have happened to him, except he would have been paired with his buddies. So you don't know how that would have worked out either. So,
yeah,
right.
The other reason the reason we're seeing the shift is because, as Bruce Pritchard pointed out, they had to, right? The steroid trial, right? Brandon, you mentioned about Shawn Michaels being involved with steroids to some level, probably not as much as most people or a lot of people, but even for WrestleMania 9, you started to see this. I mean, Hogan came back, but Hogan had taken a lot of time away, and a lot of other big guys. Warrior was gone. The British Bulldog, another big jacked up guy, was hurt. A lot of these other guys had kind of moved on because of the steroid trial, and Vince needed to distance himself from that. So he needed these guys like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels and guys who were obviously not that jacked up to, carry the Federation forward. That was another big reason for the shift.
Yeah. Danny, I mean, as we wind down here, I mean, the whole shift after WrestleMania 10, I mean, that just kind of showed that there was more guys on the roster that they can throw out there, and kind of what we're seeing now kind of detract the attention from what the steroid trial is going on to, hey, look, we've got new guys here. We've got a new, fresh look going forward. Hogan's not here anymore, so don't worry about it. So as to what we're seeing now as far as the Vince McMahon scandal going on right now with the allegations.
Yeah, and I agree with Brandon too. Like, Brett was a good wrestler. Shawn Michaels was like a 90s version of Ric Flair. It was, the promo was everything. And I'm thinking back to, Saturday nights, NWA, back in that studio, in the whatever studio that was in Atlanta, the TV studio, when they had part of it, the area blacked out. And Flair's out there, and the promo that always sticks into my mind is the one when he's talking about Buddy Landell, and he goes, and ends it something about spilled liquor, and I have a hard time keeping these gaiters on. That is like the standout Ric Flair promo at the gold standard, and probably the one of the best that he did. And I think what made HBK so special as a character is he was a wrestler. He was a pretty boy, much like Flair was, but he was that arrogant jerk that you love to hate. Now, mind you, this is back when he was a notorious partier. This was back in the day when Triple H had to actually go in and take care of him because HBK was either drunk or he was high, one of the two. And then I also think back to WrestleMania, going forward to WrestleMania 12 with the infamous curtain call on MSG, where when you had Michaels was staying with WWE, Triple H was staying, and then you had Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were taken off for WCW. And who knew that was going to happen? Then these two are, in WCW, then Brett goes to WCW, and you're right. What if it had been Shawn, he would have been protected. But then too, you've also got, Brett and WCW. And again, look what happened. It really fizzled out. And I think 10 was definitely that shift over to less Hogan oriented programming because Hogan was gone. And it kind of set the precedent for what we're seeing today with storylines, character development, people filling in certain spots because this person's not available. We're just going to put you in here. So it kind of changed the trajectory a little bit of what we're seeing today.
Well, I'll say this much for, I know I give AEW a hard time, but I want to put them over for a second. One of the things Tony does that I really enjoy is the music. And the reason I bring that up is, you debut Adam Copeland, and the music pumps out, and it's the song that everybody recognizes and associates with Adam Copeland, Edge.
Right.
Bret Hart's music is iconic for the WWF.
It is.
And if WCW would have had the foresight, or even Brett, because, he said that, Vince is the one that came to him, said, dude, I can't honor this contract, see what they'll pay you. If he'd have had the foresight to go, all right, I'll do this, but, part of my deal is I need to take my song with me.
Right.
Because, that music that they gave him in WCW was just kind of,
it was just out of the Turner catalog.
Yeah, it's like
I don't even remember it, to be honest with you.
Well, that's not memorable.
It was terrible.
There's a reason for that.
The two things with Brett that I think they, I'm sure they could have worked in a deal for his song, and that would have popped that whole audience if the Hitman's music would have actually hit instead of some bland something out of the Turner catalog.
Mm-hmm.
And also, instead of making him wait 3 weeks to debut on TV, they should have brought I would have been Bischoff on the phone going, look, man, I get you're pissed. And that's why I want you on TV Monday night. Come out here and air all those grievances while it's fresh. I want that fresh wound on my TV show. Say whatever you want. I will edit what I have to. Just the mic is yours. I'm not telling you a word to say. Say what you need to. But they waited 3-4 weeks before they ever brought him out on TV. And by that time, it was
they couldn't though, Brandon. They couldn't, because there were already lawsuits. And Bischoff has actually talked about this. He was under edicts from Turner Legal that, no, you don't do that anymore. No. Like, don't.
That one I haven't heard. So
yeah,
I've listened to a lot of Bischoff stuff, but I haven't listened to that. But all right, take that out of the equation. Being Vince,
he could have done something. They should have done something. I agree with you.
Like I said, being Vince is the one that said, "Hey, go negotiate your deal." So okay, I will, but I want my music. Because And maybe back then they didn't think about it, but it's been proven today. Like the pop the Hardys got because Tony had their music when Jeff Hardy made his debut.
Right.
The Hardys came
out. Those options. Like Ed basically, I think, had a deal to have his music, right? Yep. The Hardy Boys also had a deal. Like some of them WWE owns and they have copyrights on, right? Like and Punk is able to have his music wherever he goes.
For the right price, and if it's the right superstar, wrestler, however you want to call it, it can be done.
Yeah.
And for certain people, like with Bret Hart debuting on Nitro or the pay-per-view, whenever he debuted, I forget. The pop would have been, enormous if his music would have hit and they knew that's who was coming.
Could have been huge, but I don't see at that time. I don't see Vince letting it happen. I really don't.
Right.
But who knows?
That's the thing. And that's the thing with it is with music is because we were so familiar with the Jim Johnson catalog of music in the days of WWF that now you're seeing wrestlers go to the promotions and they have their song because it's in that contract now. It's that I need that song. That song is me. There's a reason why that song has been synonymous with me because it's me. It's my song. And so I think it's just like you said, Brandon, that's why I also love Tony Khan for when he fights for that. Where WWE, because it's such a great pluglometer, it's just like, well, we have this generic music, we'll throw you out to it, and that's it, and but with certain wrestlers, that music is that's their whole persona is that music, because once that music hits, you know who it is. The glass shattering, Stone Cold.
Right.
If you smell, that's The Rock. Or you didn't know, that's DX.
They tried to change up.
The guitar, that's Bret Hart, but that's their persona.
Yeah, they tried to change up Austin's music during that Alliance angle for a little while, but that didn't go over too well.
No, they changed that a little bit.
It had the glass shadow. You Disturbed.
They put Disturbed in there for a while as kind of the take on it. But no, I think we covered some really good stuff tonight. And we're already over the 2-hour mark, so don't want to go too far. I know I said we could cover other stuff, but don't want to push it too much, because mainly just a lot to talk about with these WrestleManias. But some great stuff, some good stories, definitely some great information we share with Brandon and Amer, and great stories we hear about Danny and her younger years of, watching the old school wrestling of, you said AWA.
Yeah.
Yeah, the AWA. So, just stories like that, talking about WrestleManias of the old, just kind of brings the stories out. So I do want to thank you guys for coming on tonight and sharing all that with us and discussing all these cards. And thank you to everybody who tuned in, watch. Make sure we subscribe, we hit that like button, we share, and tell all your friends about us. We are on YouTube, we are on Spotify, we're everywhere, make sure you guys catch up. We did have first episode last week covering 1 through 5 tonight, obviously 6 through 10. Tomorrow we do have a live Rampage reaction. Then Saturday, I do believe we still have the Collision reaction. And then Wednesdays we have our live reactions. Pardon?
No Collision on Saturday.
Oh, okay. No Collision on Saturday, but
and Rampage comes on tomorrow at 7.
There you go, 7 o'clock. So, but and then we also have live reactions to Dynamite. We have interviews, most recently with the Blue Meanie, but that is also on our YouTube channel. So thank you guys again. Thank you guys for joining me on the panel, Danny, Amer, Brandon. Always great to have you guys on. Next week, make sure you guys join us. We are covering WrestleMania's 11 through 15. We are getting through to the Attitude Era here soon. Big shift to the Attitude Era, which we're all excited to talk about. And if there's nothing else, as always, to everybody, thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.